Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Please be seated. It was a couple of years ago, I was driving back from New York City to my home after seeing a musical, a matinee on a Saturday. And it would have given me plenty of time to get to church on Sunday morning, but it was raining really, really heavily, so it took forever to get out of New York City. And I was driving out on the expressway, and by then it had become dark, and it was really late at night, and heavy, heavy rain I couldn't hardly see, and I'm like creepy crawling along because I can hardly see. And then the red lights in the rearview mirror, but I knew I wasn't speeding, so why was I being pulled over? And the officer said, "Were you aware that both your headlights are out?" No, I was not. My parking lights were on, but not the headlights. I guess it was raining so hard that anyway. So he said, "You can't drive any further." Thankfully, the sun came up the next morning early enough so that I could make it to church on time. But what I thought about then is how we see. We think about seeing with our eyes, and that everything has to be clear, and that there needs to be enough light. But all the readings today talk about dark and light and sight, but it's not seeing with our eyes in the way we think of, not seeing in the light like we think of. Jesus is talking about something different, inviting us to consider that maybe there are other ways to see and to know and to understand and to be. So the first reading today from Samuel, let me give you just a little bit of a backstory, is the people of Israel said, "We want a human king like all the other countries have human kings." And God said, "You have me. I'm the king, that should be enough." And they said, "Yeah, but we want a human king like the other people have." And God said, "Well, go ahead." So they picked Saul, and it didn't work out very well. He was not a good leader or king. So God stepped in and said, "It's time for me to appoint a king." And he said to Samuel, the prophet, Saul's right-hand man, "Time to go and anoint one of Jesse's sons." And Saul's like, "Uh-oh, Saul will kill me if he knows I'm anointing somebody else." But God said, "Tell him that you're there to make sacrifice." Okay. So he went, Samuel went, brought the heifer, said, "I'm here to make sacrifice." Talked to Jesse, said, "I'd like to meet your sons before we celebrate the sacrifice." So Jesse brings out his sons. Samuel looks on the oldest son, who was tall and attractive, and, first son should be him. Samuel's like, "We're ready to go." And God says, "No. You're looking on his appearance and his height. You're looking with your eyes. But God knows your heart." See, we look on the outward appearance, and God looks on the heart. And it reminds me of when I was a child going to church. In those days, girls and women wore hats and matching coats and white gloves and patent leather shoes and the white socks with the scratchy lace, because how you looked on the outside said something about you. I'm not sure. So that if we looked perfect when we went to church, if we looked good on the outside, then that meant our lives were good, right? And then we could spend the rest of the week being whoever we were and wearing whatever clothing. But God is saying, I know your heart. I know your intentions. And that's what we should be looking at, not the outward appearance. So Samuel goes through the 7 sons, and each one God says, "Nope, not that one. Nope, not that one." And after 7 sons, Samuel says, "Well, do you have any others?" And he said, "Well, it's the young one out in the field tending the sheep." And Samuel said, "Well, bring him in, because we can't celebrate until..." Brings in this young, ruddy complexioned boy, and God says, "This is the one." Totally went against everything that everybody believed. But what I say is that it's hard for us to see when God is doing a new thing. Over and over and over again, God does a new thing, and we have a hard time seeing it, or we refuse to see it because it doesn't make sense to us, or because we're a little bit afraid, or because we doubt, or because we question, or because we're tired, or whatever. We have a hard time seeing God at work in the world. And so today we get to the gospel, and Jesus encounters this man who was born blind. And immediately the disciples say, well, who sinned, his parents or him? And we say, well, that's kind of an outdated thing to ask, but I know whenever I've been with parents, when a child is born with something, the parents say to themselves, did we do something wrong? Or when we get an illness later in life, we say, did we do something wrong? We still have that in the back of our minds. And Jesus says, no, neither sinned. I'm here, he's here, so that you can see the works of God. I'm doing a new thing. And Jesus immediately picks up the dirt, spits in it, makes some mud, puts it on his eyes, says, go wash in the pool of Siloam. He does, and immediately he can see. And all the neighbors see him and say, isn't he the man born blind? Isn't he? And they're like, no, can't be him, not him, must be somebody else. They're questioning. They start judging. They go and tell the Pharisees, something's happening here that we don't understand. And so the Pharisees say, well, were you born blind? Yep. And on the Sabbath, this guy, this sinner, to do this thing on the Sabbath? And he's like, yep. Well, who was this man? The Pharisees don't even give it a second thought. It's not okay, so it can't be possible. How did it happen? And they question, how did it happen? How did it happen? And he's like, I don't know. He put mud on my eyes, told me to wash. The Pharisees could not see. So then the Pharisees go and get his parents. Was he born blind? Yep. Now he sees? Yep. How did that happen? And they're like, didn't see anything, didn't hear anything, don't know anything. He's an adult, ask him. They were afraid. They couldn't see. So they bring back the man again. Who was this man? What did he do? He's like, all I know was I was blind and now I see. Which is the line in Amazing Grace that John Newton wrote, the ship of the slave trade, when all of a sudden it clicked for him. I was blind, but now I see. Not sight, not light, but that understanding, that work of God saying, what you're doing was not right, and now I get it. Now I get it. In this season of Lent, we're at the fourth Sunday of Lent, which is Lautere Sunday, which is Refreshment Sunday, and some Anglo-Catholic churches wear pink. It's a break Sunday. It's also known as Mothering Sunday. It was the Sunday in which in Latin times you let the slaves go back to the mother church where they were baptized. It's a day of rest because, think spring equinox, the sun is coming back into the world. The light is coming back into the world, preparing us, giving us this glimpse of Easter in the midst of Lent. It's an invitation for us to see just a little bit differently what God is doing in this world, in our lives, in this parish. Now, I know that I want to see as God sees. I want to know your heart and not make these preconceived notions about who people are. But I also know that there are so many obstacles that get in my way. Doubt, or fear, or history, or I'm too busy. The list goes on and on and on. But what I know is I long to see with the eyes of God. And so for just this week in this season of Lent, I invite us to walk by faith and not by sight.